Hello class and welcome. My name is Joshua McConnell and I will be giving a micro teaching lesson on social cognitive theory, self-concept, and the theory of moral development. Let's jump in. Our learning objectives will be to demonstrate with 100% mastery level understanding of social cognitive theory developed by Albert Bandura, self-concept developed by Carl Rogers, and the theory of moral development as espoused by Lawrence Kohlberg. Social cognitive theory was developed by Albert Bandura. His theory is premised on a critique of the unidirectional causality of human behavior. This problematic posits that behavior is shaped and controlled entirely either by environmental factors or one's own internal disposition. Bandura's theory of social cognition serves as a corrective, postulating the multidirectionality of behavior, environmental stimuli, and personal influences. In this agentic transactional approach, an analogism he refers to as reciprocal determinism, individuals are not simply malleable subjects of external stimulation, but process environmental events and information through their own cognitive processes. More simply, Bandura's objective is to explain psychosocial functioning in terms of tridactic reciprocal causation. As he succinctly points out, cognitive factors partly determine which external information will be observed, how they will be perceived, whether they have any lasting effects, what valiance and efficacy they have, and how the information they convey will be organized for future use. Social cognitive theory rests on the assumption that humans exhibit an extraordinary capacity for, as he terms, symbolization. By this, Bandura is referring to the ability to comprehend, create, regulate environmental events. As we've already seen, Bandura believes that external information is processed through one's own cognitive faculties. Therefore, as he describes, symbolization allows people to process and transform experiences, whether personal or vicarious, into cognitive models that serve as guides for judgment and action. In a term Bandura refers to as vicarious verification, by which our ability to observe others' transaction with the environment and their effects provides verification on the efficacy of our own thoughts and actions. Symbolic modeling therefore allows us to match behavior and action through observational learning. In Bandura's treatment, observational learning is governed by four sub-processes: attentional, retention, behavioral reproduction, and lastly, motivational. Attentional processes determine what is selectively observed and what information is extracted from previously modeled events. Retention codes that information extracted by model events into internal guides for memory representation and cognitive rehearsal. Behavioral reproduction occurs when symbolic conceptions are integrated into executable actions, which are then efficaciously juxtaposed against the behavior one is modeling. For an example, if one student sees another student acting out, said student is likely to exhibit or mimic that same behavior into executable actions. Motivational processes occur as the last rehearsal process. People are more likely to model efficacious behavior than performances that result in deleterious or punishable effects. Bandura's symbolic coding and rehearsal processes become more sensible when we consider his seminal Bobo doll experiment. This research, initially conducted in 1961, studied the transmission of aggression through imitation of aggressive models. As he says in the outset of his study, in the experiment reported in this paper, children were exposed to aggressive and non-aggressive adult models and were then tested for amounts of imitative learning and a new situation in the absence of the model. Let's take a look.
My initial research in observational learning centered on the social modeling of aggression. In our experiment, preschool children observed an adult model beat up an inflated Bobo doll in novel ways. Now, the children who had observed the aggressive modeling adopted much of it.
Now, with a partner, I want you to discuss the classroom implications of Bandura's social cognitive theory. How might reciprocal determinism, symbolization, and/or observational learning through symbolic coding and rehearsal processes operate in the classroom setting? Pause the video and reflect with the partner your thoughts. The philosophy and psychology of the self and the research on self-concept has a long history. Carl Rogers contributed to this area of research by fundamentally altering the approach of psychotherapy from a therapist-centered approach, where the therapist would evaluate one's dilemmas and produce an expert solution, to a client-centered approach by positioning the self for evaluating and resolving one's own dilemmas. Rogers defines self-concept in his seminal work on client-centered psychotherapy as: these terms refer to the organized, consistent conceptual configuration composed of perceptions of the characteristics of the I or me and the perception of the relationship of the I or me to others and to various aspects of life, together with the values attached to these perceptions. In a less convoluted wording, self-concept describes the perception one has to oneself and the perception others hold of oneself. The constitution of self-concept is comprised of three main components: self-image, how we see ourselves both in the world and to ourselves; self-worth, or sometimes called self-esteem, what we think and what we feel about ourselves; and the ideal self, which denotes the self-concept which the individual would most like to possess, upon which they place the highest value for themselves. When an individual's self-experiences are symbolized and included in their self-concept, then they are in a state of congruence of self and experiences. Let's look at the implications of this theory when applied to education. In the teacher-student network, this notion of congruence, similar to the psychotherapeutic approach, characterizes a relationship grounded in empathy, and to use Rogers' terms, unconditional positive self-regard. Student-centered teaching involves empathy insofar as the teacher understands the student's world as seen through their own purview. Moreover, this involves being in tune with the student's personal feelings, be it anger, frustration, failure, or shame, in their confusion as if it was one's own. Unconditional positive self-regard is one of the theory's key components. According to Roger, unconditional positive self-regard occurs when one values the person, in our case the student, irrespective of their differential values which one might place on her or his specific behavior. This means that the teacher accepts them in all of their positivity and failures. In this particular milieu, the student can feel more accepted in their shortcomings and growth and become more of a congruent person.
I am very fortunate, and the client is very fortunate, if I can feel I really accept you fully just as you are. Sometimes that's very difficult. I held an interview with a young man in South Africa. I didn't know anything about him. It turned out he was an officer in the South African Army. Now, for me, that meant it meant that I stretched my empathic abilities to their very limit to try to be with him, to try to understand him, to try to be caring toward him. I didn't feel I did too well. And yet, I've learned since that interview really changed the course of his life. Um, so I feel that if I can be genuinely understanding, try to uh, listen not only to the words but to the meaning, trying to understand the person that's hidden within each one of us, that's helpful. If I really care about this person uh, in an unconditional way, that's helpful. If I can really be myself in the relationship, not a professional expert, not a, quote, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, just me in that relationship, that's helpful. All those things are possible, and when they come together, that creates a very powerful climate for change, for growth, uh, for drawing out the potential of the client.
Now, I want you to reflect. Has there been a time where you exhibited empathic understanding and or positive self-regard in your classroom? Pause the video and let me know your thoughts. Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development grew out as an extension of John Piaget's stages of cognitive development present in children. In his 1958 doctoral thesis, Kohlberg studied 75 American boys, ages 10 through 16, and recorded their responses to hypothetical moral dilemmas. Based off the reasoning of their responses to these moral dilemmas at a given age, Kohlberg constructed an age-related topology of definite and universal levels of development in moral thought. This topology consists of 3 distinct levels of moral thinking, and within each of these levels are 2 related stages. Let's take a closer look and consider each individual level and stage. Pre-conventional morality is the first of the 3 levels. Here, as Kohlberg describes, the child is responsive to cultural rules and labels of good and bad, right or wrong, but understands these concepts through a punishment-reward paradigm. This level is divided into 2 stages. Stage 1, the punishment and obedience orientation. Here, the physical consequences determine the efficacy, the good or bad, of executable actions regardless of their human and cultural rationality. This stage is marked by avoidance of punishment and execution of reward based on actions. Stage 2, the self-interest orientation, describes morally sound judgment insofar as its utilitarian value in satisfying one's needs or the needs of others. This quid pro quo, or transactional orientation, is best summarized in the pithy expression, "You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours." One only follows rules when it's within their or someone else's immediate self-interest. Conventional morality, level 2, maintains the expectations of people closest to you, be they family, friends, or nation. Stage 3, the interpersonal concordance or good boy, nice girl orientation. This stage characterizes moral judgment as that which pleases or helps. As Kohlberg delineates, there is much conformity to stereotypical images of what is majority or natural behavior. One desires to maintain social rules in which support acceptable behavior. Stage 4, social maintaining orientation. There is an orientation towards authority, fixed rules, and the maintenance of social order. Laws are to be upheld, and right behavior consists of showing respect for authority and maintaining the social order. Post-conventional morality, level 3, defines sound moral judgment and principles outside the structure of authority, or people holding these beliefs and one's own personal identification with these groups. Stage 5, social contract orientation. Here, morally efficacious principles are defined in terms of general individual rights and in terms of standards that have been evaluated by society at large. This stage is marked by the relativism of personal values and opinions and a corresponding emphasis on procedural rules for reaching consensus. In other words, this stage recognizes the heterogeneity of individual opinions and values, but sets a general standard for what is good or bad, right or wrong. As such, people at this stage may sometimes openly disobey rules that they find inconsistent with their own personal values and opinions. Stage 6, the universal ethical principle orientation. Here, people have a principle conscious and will follow universal ethical principles regardless of what the official law or rules state. At the heart of this stage, these are universal principles of justice, of the reciprocity and equality of human rights, and of the respect and dignity of the human being as an individual. Kohlberg's theory of moral development, as well as the level and individual stages, will become a lot more concrete when we consider his seminal Heinz dilemma.
Heinz's dilemma. Heinz's wife is dying because of a special kind of cancer. There's only one drug that the doctors think might save her. It is a new formula which a pharmaceutical company in the same town has recently discovered. The drug is very expensive to produce, but the company is charging 10 times the production cost. Heinz goes to everyone he knows to borrow money, but he can only collect half of what the drug costs. He tells the CEO of the company that his wife is dying and asks him to sell it for less so if he could pay at a later time. But the CEO refuses. He can make no exceptions. The research had been very expensive and the company needs to turn in a profit. What should happen next?
As we wrap up, I want you to pick a theory and briefly explain its practical implications in your classroom. Reflect and let me know your thoughts below. Thank you, and it's been a pleasure.